Hello everyone. I wanted to do a book review of a book that I have read twice. Is Found inTranslation: How Language Shapes Our Lives and Transforms the World. I'm going to show my thoughts and how this applies to language learning and how we can apply our language learning skills. So let's get started. What I really like the book is written by Natalie Kelly and Jos Zetsche. So this book is written by interpreters. I believe they speak Spanish. One of them speaks Spanish, one of them speaks German. And really and truly, I like this book because it really showcases and really fully in-depth explains how language abilities and people working in this industry are actually affecting every different aspects of our lives and our careers and our forms of entertainment. I mean, the first chapter basically starts off with saving lives and protecting rights in translation. So it really talks about medical aspects, how when it comes to translation, basically when you don't translate things correctly, it can cause problems. Like it was talking about in the first aspect that there was a difference between when you say intoxicado in Spanish, it doesn't mean exactly the same thing as it means in English, intoxicated, because it can alter what kinds of treatments you get. So in Spanish, when you say intoxicado, it means poisoned, like you've been poisoned by something. Whereas it doesn't, it's a kind of like a false friend, because it doesn't mean intoxicated, and intoxicated in English has a connotation that it has to do with you've been drinking, and it's you're intoxicated, you're public intoxication, and that's not the case. And so that actually was a $7 million lawsuit. So, and then they talk about these experiences, and they do have a lot of references. So I recommend you read this book, so you kind of understand where I'm coming from. Or if you like this video, you can also go and get it yourself and read it and love it as much as I do. And so it's just when you talk about aspects of health industries, it also even goes into, I want to look into the table of contents, diplomacy, war. It also talks about in the aspect of how a lot of the languages that are in demand in the U.S. specifically for the military, we don't have many people. And he mentions it even more so so in the second chapter, particularly I think on page 44 to 45, it really talks about the fact that we have a deficit, and that's the reason why we're kind of behind on certain aspects. Because even this is where it talks about with the aspect of 9/11, it says tomorrow is 0 hour, the match is about to begin. Al-Qaeda operatives issued these words in a communication on September 10th, 2001. The messages spoken in Arabic on tapped phone conversations were intercepted successfully by U.S. intelligence on the same day. Unfortunately, they were not translated until September 12th, the day after the terrorist attacks. It goes on really to say that first, American students are not exactly known for their passion for foreign language studies. Add to that a lack of investment in foreign language learning by the government over the past few decades, and what do you get? A major shortage of people with proficiency in critical languages. So one of the things is that it brought up a point that is kind of what I'm kind of working to achieve, is that, when you think about it, 9/11, as serious as that was, is that because we had a shortage of people who could translate that. And the thing is that when you're working with a government agency, especially intelligence, intelligence can cover a lot of different things. I'm not a government official. I can't really say, that this is accurate or not, but, but from my own and from my, from my own thought process is that when you're part of like an agency like the CIA and you're constantly having to intercept threats, to the U.S. within, or within the U.S. or things like that, there's a lot of information because there's a lot of things going on. And if you don't have the people that can, a good amount of people who can translate and even or interpret those types of, in this case, in intercepted phone calls, you can have instances where critical information can be delayed. So like when we're thinking about Arabic may not be like a very common language, because I know like in schools, I know it's very common to learn Spanish and French. Some schools, I know when I was in high school, I believe Japanese was taught, like AP Japanese, like, all the way from Japanese 1 to AP, I believe. But it's very rare to get, wide variety of languages. And, like the fact is it's in demand, so that kind of, and like I said, the seriousness of 9/11. So that actually shocked me the first time I read that. I was like, we intercepted it, successfully, as it says, but we didn't get to translate it until 2 days later, after that tragedy happened. So that's kind of something we need to kind of, I think when we look at these kinds of aspects, it's more of like, how can we improve and move forward? Okay, we know this. How can we improve within our education system? Because the other thing is our education system, it's not just like learning your ABCs and how to be literate, but it's also learning skills that can be benefit to, that can be of a benefit to, someone's careers. Like language will always open up career opportunities. And especially when you look at the military, the State Department, immigration, those are aspects where language skills are going to be very, very prominent. So that was something that I really thought was very fascinating. They talked about different things about like doing business, how sometimes like when we look at like language and culture is like the way we conduct business can be different how other people conduct business. And even when we look at things like developing an app, the name that you may call it in, your language may actually sound like a bad word in another country. It's funny, like when we think about the word computer, for us it's like, oh, computer, but in French they call it ordinateur, because computer, it sounds like a very obscene word. There's like, oh, there's pute in there, and I don't want to kind of get into teaching bad words on the internet. So they kind of you have to change the name, and you have to find creative ways to translate it to where it's not something that is offensive, and it's not something that can be mistranslated or misinterpreted. So that's something to really, really think about, as you're learning your languages and kind of finding use for them. Other aspects is like, I think there's a part in this chapter where they were talking about I think it was like a Japanese themed hotel restaurant. And what they did was they hired someone who's familiar with Japanese culture, like to a T, to make it, because I think it was because relating to the fact that there were a lot of people coming from Japan, specifically with, Toyota, and the automobile industry. And so they wanted people to feel like they were at home in another country. And so it was like, and apparently this restaurant or something, I will link that, like I will write it, the name of it, but it was like really big, it had really big ratings, and it was very popular because it was an authentic experience. Everything down from the cuisine, how to prepare it, the aspects of the interior decoration. It was something that people tried to replicate, but they couldn't do it to the exact extent. So that it makes a difference. It's also, like I said, it's good for business, even though like I feel like sometimes there are people out there that have this sort of mentality, and it is true. There are people out there that think, oh, well, this is America and people should speak English. But you gotta remember when we do international business, we're working with people who do not always conduct their own business the same way that we do. And so like when you think about, airline industries, like Southwest, Delta, a lot of these like, US companies, they have contracts and they have agreements and all these different international laws they have to adhere to when it comes to flying internationally. There's a lot of things that go into that. When we think about flight attendants who speak 2 or more languages, they get paid much more than anyone who can only speak English and are only doing, domestic flights, because they have to actually translate all of those announcements in 2 or 3 languages. Like when I flew Air Tahiti to Paris, I remember the flight attendants having to translate everything, having to say the announcements in English, French, and Tahitian. So that's a lot, knowing 3 languages and having to translate them to where people can understand them. And not only that, but on the back end, a lot of times these attendants, they're actually reading from a script that was written for them, and they've had to memorize, so someone else had to think of how to say all these different announcements in all these different languages in a way where it can make sense, especially considering that, like, a lot of times grammar doesn't translate exactly the same way in every single language, unfortunately. Another thing that I think was really interesting was they were talking about like religious aspects, because like when we think about the fact that I can only speak from the fact that I am a Christian. I can't speak for any other faith, but I know for us is that there's a lot of history specifically within the Bible, and they talked about, like, in historical reference when specifically when Martin Luther translated the Bible from Latin into German. So it was exclusive access to the Bible, specifically for those people who were only able to speak Latin. And a lot of people were illiterate because it costs money to learn these things. Yeah, it costs money to like be able to be taught to read Latin outside of just German. And it was more of like, priests and monks and all these people within the Catholic Church at that time, they were basically telling people anything, like, oh, give all your money to the church and your sins will go away. Most of you kind of know this from like your history class, and I really like this point that they brought up here on page 120. It says, within a few months of Luther's translation being printed, folks from all walks of life began to discuss the Bible with priests, monks, and even highly educated masters of theology. Lay people began to contradict and even argue with members of the clergy. Women were suddenly found holding intellectual arguments with men. The church's ability to hide behind Latin was gone. Luther's translation gave information to the masses, a powerful weapon that, combined with other factors, triggered a societal transformation. So, when you think about it, like, first of all, the idea of translating the entire Bible, because the Bible is a lot, a lot to read. I have never read the entire Bible cover to cover. There's a lot of content to cover. But then it's also when you're reading it and it's translated to you, again, as I said, it opens up a lot of different conversations because you can understand it versus like taking someone's word for it. Part of that I think goes with like, illiteracy, because it, like I said before, back in this time, like I think it's like the 1600s or so, we didn't have like public schools where it was like mandated that you go to school and you learn Latin. A lot of wealthy people had private tutors so they can understand this. And so a lot of times it was more of people who had access, were able to read the Bible as it was in Latin. So translation can open up a lot of different conversations. And as it says, specifically says societal transformation. So, as it described, people having more, arguing with people because it's like, no, this is not what this says. You've been lying to me. You've been lying to me. So I think it's really great that, with the aspect of translations, it can, like, as we know, like Christianity is spread all over the world, and it's been translated. The Bible has been translated in so many different languages to where everyone has access to it. So basically with translation, a lot of times, especially when we think about, access to the Bible, for example, like I said, I'm only speaking from Christianity because that's my faith and my own personal experiences. I don't know if this is the same for anyone else who worships another, religion or doesn't have a religion. So obviously, like I said, I'm just speaking for myself. But, having access to be able to discuss the Bible with someone else from another culture because they have access to that information. And I feel like sometimes we may take that for granted because we think, oh, everything's translated to English. But like, when we think about international news, and that actually is something I think they talked about a little bit in here with like when it comes to journalism. I can't remember which chapter it was, but it's like journalism, because there are people who, like, when you look at the news, like field reporters who have to talk to these people in whatever language it is, and being able to, like when you watch the news and you hear people conversing with people who don't speak, their native language. Like, I've been watching the UN General Assembly this week, and, a lot of times there are a lot of speeches where it's like, you'll hear them say something in their native language, and then all of a sudden the sound gets cut off, and then you hear a voiceover in your language. Don't take for granted that is somebody who has taken years to learn a language and is able to translate or interpret that. And there's a lot that goes into how, in these diplomatic these diplomatic, circumstances where people have to translate these things. So that's really important. Other things, when we think about when it comes to technology is like, let's say you make a website for your business. You obviously want to have search engine optimization, but when you have your website and it's in another language and trying to match the keywords to not only your target language or your native language, but then also to other languages or other people, reaching other people that you're trying to attract, So that's another aspect to really think about from a business standpoint. Like also like when we think about things like context, because it really talks about in like, when you're talking about like sports and you had a whole section where they're talking about sports and how that kind of when we use interpretation to kind of basically conduct sporting events. When you think about like the World Cup or the Olympics, when they have referees and they have judges, they actually have to be able to translate what they're, like when a ref makes a bad, it makes a call to say, hey, you're getting a red flag or something like that. It's like they have to explain to these people who speak a completely different language what was the reason why they got that. That's the thing. So having people who can speak multiple languages, even in the Olympics, which actually I signed up to volunteer for the Olympics. I won't find out until like sometime this fall whether or not I'm going to do that or not, because and that's great because at least I'll be able to know, have enough time to know to figure out when and if I'm going, that kind of thing. The Olympics, their official languages are English and French. And I'm like, I speak both of those languages, but but then when they host the Olympic Games in another country that doesn't speak those languages natively, there's a lot of interpreters that got to go in there, because when you have people from all over, you can't expect everyone to speak English, but at the same time, you still have to accommodate the fact that there are people who need, interpretation. And sometimes people may know English, but they don't, they're not at a level where they can understand it like the same way I do. Because I'm a native speaker, so I will always be able to understand English, but some people who may have learned it as a second language, they may know it, they may be fluent, but, there might be some things that they don't understand. Because even for me in French, I teach it, and I can understand it. I can survive without English, but at the same time, there might be some things or some nuances that I don't catch, which is why, we have interpreters so that everyone can fully understand, And so, and also like when you think about like TED Talks, there's TED Talk, like if you go on the actual website, not their YouTube channels, but if you actually watch them on their website, they have so many different like subtitles. And people actually do that. Like there's their job to translate and, make subtitles for those TED Talks. And because the whole theme is, sharing ideas, and especially that's also a global concept too. And for people to get those concepts and those different ideas that are being shared at a TED conference, they have to be translated. They have to be interpreted. So I think my overall with, having read this book is I really understand that there's a really big purpose to interpreters and translation. It's happening every day, and I feel like we shouldn't take it for granted, because having interpreters and being able to be an interpreter is you're giving people access to information that they wouldn't have otherwise. When you think about it, we just survived a global pandemic, and in spite of that is that, with the World Health Organization, because everyone around the world was, being hurt by the coronavirus, is that we had to kind of get together and figure out a solution, everyone around the world. And so we had to find ways through language to be able to collaborate, because you can't collaborate if nobody understands each other. So I really, really hope that you take the time to go and get this book. I think it's a really great read if you really want to understand the essence and the necessity of interpreters and translators across all industries. So this is also really great, I think, if you're a business owner and you have some international ambition, so you can kind of have a sense of how you can how language is going to affect, language and culture can affect, how you go about that. So there's a lot of things to consider. So bye.